So it's common parlance to say that feminism is not anti-male, but I was like, I think my research certainly shows it was anti-black male. The history of feminism in this country is not based in equality. That's just a fact. Started from suffrage to Jim Crow to segregation, feminism was about aligning white women with dominant male power. And again, what I think is interesting about this is when you look at the development, so the idea of woman didn't always mean oppressed. Women were not considered minority categories or outgroups the same way that black people and Jews were in the early 20th century. There are actually a series of articles where white women were trying to debate this. So like you could look at Alva Myrtle's work in The American Dilemma as an appendix, a parallel to the Negro problem. You could look at Hacker's piece in the American Journal of Sociology, I think is around 51. And these white women are trying to say, okay, well, look, now that we're coming to the close of the imperial phase of the United States, how do we kind of focus on domestic politics in such a way that women, which they mean, of course, white women, are recognized as socially disadvantaged, just like the Negro or the Jew? And this is a profound moment in the literature, because before that period of time, white women were largely understood to be mothers or be synonymous with home or nation. Like that's how the feminine is articulated from 19th century ethnology to early anthropology.
So the assumption is like, oh, they love this whole situation. They're just all going along with it or something.
Yeah. And this is what's crazy about it. Like the history is that white women enjoy the privileges of racial domination. They didn't align themselves with racialized people. And I mean this very seriously. We're taught feminism as if white women wanted the right to vote, and then we talk about this as a privilege, that black men got the right to vote first. But if you look at those debates, in 1867, 1868, 1869, that is not what you find. It was not that black men just woke up out of slavery and they automatically gave them the right to vote. This is people like Frederick Douglass and Purvis debating that black men are not savage and that the right to vote is necessary to protect them from violence. That the reason that slavery and part of the racism exists is because they have no rights to determine the course of their own lives, that they still will be ruled. When these white women made the similar argument, Douglass's fear, right, and this was a fear of people like Kelly Miller as well, was that the overwhelming racism of white suffragettes would impede the freedom and liberation of black people. And in fact, that's exactly what was said. In the Revolution, which is the magazine or newspaper that was dedicated to getting universal suffrage during a period of time, or well, actually it's a backlash to the universal suffrage or suffrage for white women, that was funded by George Francis Train, who was a pro-slavery advocate even after the abolition of slavery, right? These feminists sided with the Democratic Party. They sided with people like Train that supported the inferiority and demanded the continued subjugation of black people, even in the 1860s after the end of slavery, right? The late 1860s. So why do we not see these connections? When these white women say that savage manhood is going to ruin white womanhood, when people like Bell Kearney writes that, we can easily dominate the Negro because if we enfranchise the white woman to vote, it settles the race question, right? Like these things matter. Bell Kearney was part of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, right? These are their founders. These are their leaders. And this doesn't give us somehow context or insight into what the movement was about. When you get to the 20th century, after they've been trying to partner with white men through colonial ventures and colonizing the world and taking on the white woman's burden, the mother of the darker races ideal, then you get this idea that suddenly they're a minority group. And guess who they were using as the basis of that? Black people. So you can literally read these articles and they're saying, well, the Negro is treated like this, or the Negro is a victim of paternalism, the woman is a victim of paternalism. Check. They're the same. So it's just a match, right? Every characteristic that the Negro has, the white women make the argument they have the same characteristic. Hence, if the Negro is a minority group, the white woman is a minority group. This is what their arguments are. So I ask myself, and I ask people very seriously, if the position of black people, especially black men, are being used as a template for white women to construct the notion that they're actually a minority, just remember, because this is a movement where the republic is white. Like, you're a white person. That's how we're defining race. So you have all the privileges of a white person. You're subjugated to white men, right? And this is what Alva Murrow talks about in terms of paternalism, not patriarchy, paternalism, right, of being subject to the benevolence and the wishes of white men in the society, just like the Negro is, which is why she calls it a parallel problem. But this is not white women are fundamentally against white men the ways that black people are, because that discourse didn't happen until after the change in the 1950s. And then when you get to the late 70s and 80s, the very same group that you use as the model to show that women were a minority group somehow becomes patriarchs that dominate them. So you use black experience to say, hey, they're victims of paternalism just like we are. They're victims of the kind of power dynamic that will never become patriarchy just like we are. Hence, if they're subject to it and we're subject to it, we're minority groups like them. You fast forward 20 years, and somehow the black men in the Negro group that was subject to patriarchy are now patriarchs. And the white women who always ruled over these groups and wanted patriarchy becomes the victims of it. You see, this is the craziness of history. And philosophers act like this is a very public debate. You can go back and see this. They act like this debate didn't happen. White women understood that they were patriarchal. That was their claim to civilization. By the end of the 20th century, somehow they were its greatest victims. And black men who were involved with them using as the rubric of what's the pinnacle, what's the subject par excellence of patriarchal oppression, get then cast as the perpetrators of the violence, even though they use their victimization to say, hey, we too are oppressed by patriarchy or paternalism. And we run with this as the basis of feminism. We run with this as the basis of intersectionality without any true understanding of the development of the history of gender within the context of the United States, or even how what we now think of as white feminists manipulated the term using Jews and blacks and other groups as the basis of measuring their own oppression. So they become the victim par excellence, and every other group, racialized male, who was previously thought to be weak, effeminate, and victims of patriarchy, now become their patriarchal oppressors. It's one of the craziest sleights of hand in the history of the development of a theory or a category. But because we're so vastly ahistorical in our deployments of arguments about gender and sexuality, we simply can't see that as an aspect of white manipulation or feminist, assertions of power. They're trying to change the logics because with the fall of the imperial project, then everything turns to the domestic front, which is why you have them writing in the 1950s, the same time that blacks are spurring up the pieces of the civil rights movement. Because now that the world has turned inward to try to figure out the race problem, the white woman now has a benefit in participating and in many ways diffusing, right, the way in which we understand the subjugation of racialized groups. And I think that the best test of this is to look at which groups benefited from affirmative action and civil rights legislation after the 1960s and 70s. When you're looking at affirmative action, white women got all the jobs. Black men were largely unemployed, right? There was no preference for it. When you're looking at the ways in which we define sexual oppression, right? All this changed in the 1970s. Where's this discourse? If this is the case, where's this discourse in the 1800s? Where's this discourse in the turn of the century? See, you notice when we study the history of feminism, we start with voting rights, 1920, they got the right to vote. Then we're off to the civil rights movement. That's a whole lot of years between the arguments about suffrage in 1860, 1920, and the 1970s. So what are white women doing during that period of time? In the late 1800s, they're colonizing people. In the early 20th century, they're justifying segregation. In the 1970s, they're reconstructing the very idea of sex so that they become part and parcel of legislation on minority rights. But we don't study that. We don't see white women as having a deliberate stake in the building of empire, despite everything about their voting behavior and their previous histories and writings from the 19th and early 20th century tell us that that's exactly what they were invested in.
So it almost seems like the argument here is that some kind of cultural appropriation took place. There was this struggle that black men were facing, which, was a public topic of discussion in the 19th century. And then it's like that rhetoric of how we're oppressed was appropriated by white feminists, and suddenly it was turned around on the people who, from whom that rhetoric originated.
Absolutely. Right. And it's not just the rhetoric, it's the very category itself. Like when you read these articles, they're talking about the category of a minority group. So, again, we don't have a very good understanding. We've envisioned white feminism and white women as absolutely powerless, right? Just doing whatever white men say. And that's just not accurate. These women were leading newspapers and propagandas and citizen councils against integration. They were fighting against integration, saying that how would you feel if a black boy slept with or married your white daughter? Protect white womanhood is something that was said, you know, in opposition to integrating or giving, you know, black people civil and social rights. This is not an accident. This is not white women stumbled on and accidentally misappropriated the rhetoric. They didn't want anything to do with black or brown people. They wanted nothing to do with savage races throughout most of history. Their arguments were that they were better rulers than these people and should in fact rule them because they're white. So to take all that history and all that evidence and reformulate it into a narrative of universal and historical vulnerability and powerlessness, when they were claiming that they were in fact were the natural handmaidens of white supremacy and imperialism, is just grossly dishonest.
So at this point, I imagine that our black female listeners are wondering, you know, how they fit into all this. And I mean, I'm thinking back to the episode 92 of Elucidations where we talked to Christy Dodson, and you know, she expressed a concern that black women kind of get like crowded out of the popular imagination of what it means to be black. Do you think it would be fair to say that?
I mean, it depends the context, right? I mean, if you're looking at conversations about, say, something like domestic violence, then black women are certainly more present than black men as victims of domestic violence. If you're talking about police killings, then you'll have a different story there, right? I think the logics or the theory that that argument comes from is called intersexual visibility. Intersexual visibility suggests that, and this was an article that was written by Purdy and Hughes and Ibach in 2008, suggests that recognition or the lack of recognizing a group is just as bad, if not worse, than the actual death of another group. So Purdy, Hughes, and Ibach make this argument. So there's a theory called social dominance theory that was developed by Sedanius and Prado. Their argument was, under capitalist patriarchal societies, racialized outgroup men are going to be the direct targets of lethal violence more than outgroup women. And they provided an impressive amount of evidence to that effect. Purdy, Hughes, and Ibach suggested, well, that empiricism is true. Black men are incarcerated more, black men are killed more, etc. But we can read that death as a kind of male privilege. And here's why. In a patriarchal society, the idea was that men are more valued than women. So the dominant male group does not fear women, it fears other men. So the logic of the intersexual visibility argument says, well, because you pay attention to men more than you pay attention to women, these outgroup men are targeted then for more violence and more death. So they're targeting these men for death and with more lethal forms of violence is actually a form of patriarchal privilege, because that's why they're being recognized and targeted more than women. Now, why does this matter to the previous comment? Well, the argument is, well, black women get left out of conversations, so you don't focus on, you know, some of the issues with black women. But as Purdy, Hughes, and Ibach say, but the advantage of that is that that's why they're safer. That's why you don't see the same amount of incarceration. You don't see the same amount of police brutality, racial profiling, etc. The question is, do we really think that that's a privilege? Is the killing of a group because they're more feared really indicative of privilege? And then saying, well, we're not killed as much, so that means that we're somehow oppressed, right? This is what I meant earlier when I said that I think it's morally deplorable to use death as a standard of privilege. I talk about this in my book. The kind of violence and the logics that entail is, are we willing to say that victims of genocide are privileged next to the perpetrator because they were killed more? We, of course, would never say that. We would never talk about the fact that Jewish men were killed first in the genocide as a function of privilege. But when we talk about black men and their condition, we're certainly willing to make that argument that, well, we focus too much on the deaths of black men, despite the fact that they're 100-folds greater than women, black women. Do black women get ignored sometimes? Absolutely. It depends on the context. It's not across the board. And I would challenge such logics with this. In the university, black women far outnumber black men. And we're talking about upwards of 30, sometimes 40,000, depending on which set you're using to talk about it. they get over 70% of the degrees from associate all the way to PhD, JD, MD. Black men have nothing to do with whether or not those representations are dictated within academic literature. They're the minority. But we don't conceptualize them that way, despite the fact that they've been outnumbered by black women in colleges and universities since the 1970s. So what does it mean to say that women get pushed to the side? Is there a representation, especially in the early years, where the focus was on race? Absolutely. Where there were not gender distinctions made as rigidly as they are now? Absolutely. But that's not a function of black women just being excluded. That's a function of we didn't have rich concepts of gender in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s that carried the kind of intellectual and categorical weight that they do now. Right? This is what Kathleen Cleaver talks about with the Black Panther Party. She's like, people analyze the relationships between black men and women in the Black Panther Party now through the lens of gender. She's like, but that language didn't even exist back then. Right? There was no intersectionality. Intersectionality came about in the late 80s. So what does it mean to be intersectional in political groups in the 1970s? Right? This is what I mean about the revisionism. You're holding people accountable for concepts and terms that didn't even exist. And again, this is not to say that we should not focus on black women, but it's to say that in discourses about race or racism, part of those studies have to be contextual and empirical. So if I'm studying black male victims of rape or black male victims of domestic abuse, black women are wholeheartedly talked about more. They have more services, more recognition, more literature. Right? They're conceptualized as being a victim. When you're studying black men, you have to convince people that they can even be a victim of sexual violence or domestic abuse or intimate partner homicide or violence, right? It's a completely different situation. So how do we talk about that? See, the problem is that in philosophy, we say these blanket statements. We make these blanket assertions about whether or not certain groups relate to other groups in that way. And it doesn't hold up. There's no reason that it would always be the case that black men are talked about more in this society. And in the cases where they are, it's usually negative. I mean, think about the stereotypes that exist for black men. Bad fathers, rapists, criminals, deviants, hashtag black men are trash. You don't see these hashtags or conversations around black women being endorsed by black intellectuals or black academicians. Right? But you see these hashtags shared by people, employed all the way up to Yale when it's concerning black men. So how do we talk about visibility? Yes, we do talk about black men a lot, usually either as corpses because they're dead or as the fact that they're trash. We use genocidal language to talk about a group of people that are oppressed in this country because we don't view them as oppressed and having humanity. We view them as perpetrators of violence. When we talk about domestic violence in this country and the disproportionate rates of domestic violence in this country, we're talking about the disproportionate rates are due to the fact that black men are more hypermasculine and abuse and murder women. That has nothing to do with what the social science actually says on it, right? Child abuse, alcoholism, going in and out of jail, poverty, right? All these things correlate much more with domestic abuse and sexist attitudes and have done so in the literature for the last 20 years. But we don't talk about that. So when we say things like black women always are usually excluded or put on the margins, my question is in what case? And if black women have been dominating the intellectual discourse and writing about black women, not saying in general, but like specifically about black women, then why haven't they been present given the numbers or how many black women outnumber black men in the university, right? There's one journal that exists for black to publish on black male issues. I mean, you can count the number of feminist journals and journals that accept work on intersectionality and black feminism, or you can count the numbers of jobs in that area. There are no jobs available for people studying racialized masculinities in this country. Most universities don't even have courses on masculinities unless it's taught from a feminist lens. So, we have a lot of work to do to add some specificity to what we're actually talking about when we're talking about gender and the relationship between black men and black women.
So I have to say I'm intrigued by the idea that if we really want to understand gender-based oppression, we need to make the oppression of black men part of that discussion. That seems right. Yeah. And I'm kind of fascinated by this idea that, well, what if like every gender studies department in the country opened up a wing for black male studies, like hired an expert in black male studies or something? Mm-hmm. Would that be a way of addressing this, or is maybe something more radical called for, like just building the movement anew from the ground up?
Well, yeah, the first way wouldn't work. Putting black men, especially straight black men, in departments with white women is not going to be a good idea. That's just always historically felt, especially in gender departments that often exude the idea of white female vulnerability. Yeah, that's just going to be a political catastrophe. I think we need something much more radical. And again, the radicality of the position is not really that radical when you're looking at the previous work, right? The works of Anthony LaMelle, people like Robert Staples, Sylvia Wynter. Like, these arguments about feminism, both conceptually and historically, have all been made before. You know, the problem is that those are not the people we read. That's not how we read them. You know, I've seen people read Sylvia Wynter as a feminist when she's absolutely adamant that she does not participate in black feminism. She has crazy critiques of it. You know, people read Elaine Brown as being a feminist, where Elaine Brown basically says that black feminists are a bunch of angry bees, you know, and that they claim they're revolutionary, but it's anti-revolution to make so many or believe in anti-male statements. There's no camaraderie when you're fighting against systems and structures. Like, you know, there's tons of examples of black men and women making criticisms against these kinds of things. So I think you need a place, a disciplinary home where racialized men can study themselves. And this is not that different than what goes on in other countries. If you're in Australia or the UK, there are tons of people either within certain departments or, you know, in a home department, interdisciplinary department, that are doing concrete studies of masculinities. There are Obium's work that looks at Portuguese men and how the concept of hegemonic masculinity doesn't really apply to them. There's other examples throughout the world of this kind of project working. The problem in the United States is, given the racialized discourse and logics, there will never be a place for racialized men to actually be able to discuss themselves without impositions of certain assumptions from feminism. And again, that's not to say that feminism doesn't have its own benefits if you're studying women or certain groups of people. It's not that kind of blanket statement. There have been benefits to the ideology or to the paradigm, whatever you would like to call it. But at the same time, you have to concede the limitations, the glaring blind spots, the lack of clarity and definition, the idea or the term of intersectionality. You know, when I read Patricia Hill Collins saying, you know, I was in a graduate course and we didn't know what intersectionality was, but we knew it when we saw it. And, you know, that's going to give me some pause, because the arguments that intersectionality makes about black men and about other racialized men is that they're privileged, disadvantaged groups. And even when, again, going back to intersectional visibility, even when black men are more unemployed and less educated and less socially mobile and incarcerated more and have a shorter lifespan and all these things, falling out the economy and suffer from worse health consequences, how much empirical disadvantage outweighs the idea of being privileged? Like, that's what I'm at. If you compare the groups line by line and say, well, then why, if black men are privileged, why do they have all these terrible and much more severe consequences in terms of their demographic health? And then you say, but that's a privileged group, and then this group's not. I don't understand that logic, because we don't do that for white people, right? See, if we talk about white privilege, we don't say, hey, white people have more household wealth, live longer, are more educated, own more property, but they're a disadvantaged group compared to black people who have none of that. We say no. The empiricism shows that black people racially are disadvantaged. But when we talk about gender, it has nothing to do with the empirical relationship between groups of men and women. It's all about the idea that there's just male privilege, and hence being male is to be privileged. That makes no sense to me. Your claim has to have some kind of substantive content to it. So yeah, I think that because of the radicality that these ideas have to some of the founding premises of feminism and gender studies in the United States, that it has to start off as something separate. It has to be something different. And again, you know, this is a position that's looking to engage the argument. It's not adopting a moralistic strain that black men are always the most oppressed. But it does, you know, building off of social dominance theory, and I think what has been a pretty consistent finding in genocide studies, specifically looking at low-level conflicts and you know, racially repressive regimes, that there is something about patriarchy and dominant groups that target males first and foremost in an attempt to extinguish the rest of the group. And if we have this dynamic, and we've seen it for 100 years, why is that not part of any discussion that we're having on gender in the United States? For the life of me, I cannot understand that. And I think that becomes part of the reason that we're so hesitant to do something new, because feminism has become a kind of morality where anyone who speaks against it or criticizes it automatically becomes a bad person. And the names we have for those bad people are anti-woman, misogynist, sexist, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it's a discourse that suggests, well, you can't analyze it. You simply have to accept it. And think about this. This is being weaponized by groups of white women who form literally half the academy. Half the university is practically white women. There's like 625,000 white women in the academy. It's like 650 or 660, 670, something like that, white men. There's 70,000 black women, 47,000 black men, right? Like, these numbers are... So then how does a group that is that dominant get to utilize the same language? That's what I'm saying. Like, it still participates in structural realities of race and racism, segregational logics of keeping minorities certainly at the end of minority. In philosophy, white women compete for the exact same jobs in non-Western Africana or non-traditional philosophies that minority groups do, right? Despite it almost being 6,000 of them in the discipline. There's about 100 black people, right? Like, how do we see this? And how does this open this up? White departments who traditionally have a problem dealing with black people, especially black men, are not going to say hire the black male. They're going to say, well, look, it's easier just to hire the white woman. We have our issues, but I'm much more comfortable with a white woman. More white women in that department are more comfortable with another white woman, right? So, black male studies is trying to point out that kind of relational discord, not only in the ideas and discourse, but in the configuration of bodies within departments. There's an undesirability, an unwantedness to black male bodies, be they straight or gay, that makes people uncomfortable because of what it means. And I think that when you look at the research on what employers say about black men and women competing for the same jobs, you can see that danger, fear, and threats are constantly associated with black men in ways that are not with black women. And even the stereotypes of black women can be read as positives if they're trying to decide between black women and black men, right? So, again, context, right? Specificity. And I think that that's the area of black male studies that's so powerful, that you can draw comparisons between groups, female groups, other male groups throughout the world, and actually try to get at the bottom of why you see the repetition of some structures and the dissolution of others.